The cold metal floor pressed against Jake Morrison's face as consciousness slowly returned to him. His head throbbed with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Blood had dried on the side of his face, crusted and sticky. He tried to move his arms, but they felt heavy, like someone had replaced his bones with lead. The last thing he remembered was the explosion that tore through the bridge of his ship. Alarms had been screaming. Fire had erupted from the console beside him. Then his second officer, Chris Hammond, had shouted something about enemy fighters closing in from all sides. After that, everything had gone black. Jake forced his eyes open. The light above him was harsh and blue, nothing like the warm white lights of Earth vessels. He was in a cell. The walls were smooth and metallic with a faint shimmer that suggested some kind of force field technology. Beyond the transparent barrier, he could see a corridor lined with similar cells. This was not an Earth ship. This was not even an Allied vessel. The architecture was wrong, the proportions too large, the temperature too cold. He pushed himself up to a sitting position and immediately regretted it. His ribs screamed in protest and he had to bite down hard to keep from crying out. Through the barrier, he watched as guards moved past his cell. They were not human. They stood nearly 8 feet tall on powerful legs that bent backward at the knee. Their skin was covered in scales that caught the light and reflected it in shades of green and bronze. Long tails swished behind them as they walked. Their heads were reptilian with pronounced snouts filled with sharp teeth. These were Vraxians. Jake had seen them before in intelligence briefings, but never in person. The Vraxian Empire controlled a large section of this part of the galaxy, and they were known for two things: their military might and their rigid code of honor. Jake examined his cell more carefully. It was roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. There was a raised platform that might serve as a bed. A small alcove in one corner probably functioned as a waste disposal system. The walls were bare except for one panel near the sleeping platform. It looked like a maintenance access point. Above the barrier, a small device blinked with a red light, a camera or sensor of some kind. He was being watched. A voice suddenly filled the cell. It came from a speaker embedded somewhere in the ceiling. The words were alien at first, harsh sounds that grated on his ears. Then the translation kicked in and the voice became understandable, though it retained a mechanical quality. The voice informed him that he was aboard the Vraxian warship Crimson Fang. He had been captured following the engagement in the Kepler system. His ship, the Earth vessel Ranger, had been destroyed. Most of his crew was dead. He and 2 others had been pulled from the wreckage. The voice continued in that same flat tone. He had been tried by the Vraxian War Council. The trial had been conducted without his presence, as was their custom for enemy combatants. He had been found guilty of territorial violation and acts of military aggression against the Vraxian Empire. The sentence was death. The method would be neural disintegration. The execution would take place at the start of the next cycle. That gave him roughly 1 standard day. The broadcast would be sent across Vraxian space as a demonstration of what happened to those who challenged their borders. The speaker went silent. Jake sat on the cold floor and tried to process what he had just heard. He was going to die. They were going to kill him in less than 24 hours, and they were going to make a show of it. He thought about his crew. The voice had said 2 others survived. He wondered who they were. He thought about his family back on Earth. His sister Claire, who worked as a teacher in Seattle. His nephew Danny, who was only 6 years old and who loved to hear stories about space. They would get a notification. They would be told he died in the line of duty. They would never know he spent his last day in a cell waiting to be executed like a criminal. Then he heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the wall to his right. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 taps. He moved closer to the wall and listened. The pattern repeated. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 1 tap. It was code. Basic code that every officer in the Earth Defense Fleet learned during their first year at the Academy. Someone else was in the cell next to him and they were trying to communicate. Jake placed his palm against the wall and tapped back. 2 taps, pause, 2 taps. The response came immediately. 1 tap, pause, 4 taps, pause, 3 taps. Jake smiled despite the pain and fear. It was Chris Hammond. His tactical officer had survived. Over the next hour, Jake communicated with Chris through the wall. The process was slow and required concentration, but it gave him something to focus on besides his impending death. Chris confirmed that he was injured but stable. He also revealed that there was a 3rd survivor in a cell somewhere nearby. Through careful tapping, they determined it was Lisa Brennan, one of the ship's engineers. She was on the other side of Chris's cell. The three of them formed a chain of communication, passing messages through the walls. Lisa provided information that sparked the first glimmer of hope Jake had felt since waking up. She recognized the sound of the ship's engines. The vibration patterns and frequency indicated a Class 7 plasma drive system. It was an older model, one that required periodic venting of radiation buildup. The Vraxians had a reputation for using salvaged technology from other species. This ship was probably assembled from parts scavenged from a dozen different civilizations. That meant it might have weaknesses, systems that did not integrate perfectly, vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Jake examined his cell again with new eyes. The maintenance panel caught his attention. He moved the sleeping platform slightly and got a better look at it. The panel was secured with 6 fasteners that used a star pattern. It was a human design. Somewhere in the construction of this ship, the builders had used components from Earth vessels. His belt buckle had a decorative plate that could be removed. The edge of that plate might work as a makeshift tool. He worked carefully, knowing the camera was watching. He positioned himself so his body blocked the view of what his hands were doing. It took nearly 20 minutes, but he managed to loosen the first fastener. The work was painstaking and his fingers grew sore. When the first fastener finally came free, he had to stop and rest. His ribs were making it hard to breathe deeply and the exertion was taking its toll, but he had made progress. For the first time since waking in this cell, he felt like he had some control over his situation. The guards came by twice more during what Jake assumed was the day cycle. They walked past his cell without stopping, their clawed feet clicking on the metal floor. Once he heard sounds from further down the corridor. Another prisoner perhaps, or maybe a crew member going about their duties. The ship had its own rhythm, its own routine. Jake tried to memorize the timing of the guard patrols. Every piece of information might be useful. As the lights dimmed to signal the night cycle, Jake managed to remove 3 more fasteners from the maintenance panel. Behind it, he could see a tangle of wires and conduits. Some carried power, others data. All of it was shielded and protected. He could not simply rip out wires and hope for the best. Any tampering would trigger alarms. But knowing what was behind that panel gave him options. It gave him something more valuable than hope. It gave him a plan. Through the wall, Chris tapped out a message. He wanted to know if Jake had any ideas for escape. Jake tapped back slowly, carefully spelling out his thoughts. They would not escape from their cells. The barriers were too strong and the guards too vigilant. But the execution ceremony was different. The Vraxians valued honor and ritual. They would be moved to a public space. There would be witnesses. There would be protocol and ceremony. And in that moment of transition, in that space between cell and execution chamber, there might be an opportunity. It was not much of a plan. It relied on luck and timing and a dozen things going right. But it was something. Lisa tapped a response through Chris. She had noticed the same engine sounds Jake had. If they could create a disruption at the right moment, the ship's safety systems would engage automatically. The plasma vents would open to prevent a core breach. It would cause chaos. Maybe enough chaos to make a move. Jake tapped his agreement. They would wait. They would watch. They would look for any opening. And when the moment came, they would act, because the alternative was to kneel before an executioner and die for a broadcast. And Jake Morrison had not survived 3 tours in the outer colonies by accepting death quietly. Jake worked through the night cycle with careful precision. The maintenance panel was now fully removed and set aside where it would not draw attention. Behind it lay a maze of cables and conduits that hummed with energy. He could see 3 main power lines running vertically through the wall. Each was wrapped in thick insulation and protected by a secondary shield. Touching them directly would likely kill him or at least trigger every alarm on the ship. But understanding their layout gave him knowledge, and knowledge was a weapon he desperately needed. The problem was that any real sabotage would alert the guards immediately. The Vraxians were not careless. Their technology might be assembled from salvaged parts, but their security systems worked perfectly well. Every conduit had sensors. Every power line had monitors. Even if Jake could somehow disrupt the flow of energy to his cell barrier, the system would compensate within seconds. He needed a different approach. He needed to use their own protocols against them. Through the wall, Chris tapped out a question about timing. How long did they have before the execution? Jake tapped back his estimate based on the day and night cycles he had observed. Maybe 12 hours, probably less. The Vraxians seemed to operate on a schedule that was slightly shorter than Earth Standard Time. Their days lasted roughly 22 hours. That meant the execution could happen as soon as the lights came back to full brightness. Lisa sent a message through Chris. She had been listening to the engine sounds and noticed something important. The plasma drive vented excess radiation every 6 hours. It was a safety feature built into that particular model. Without proper venting, the core would overheat and eventually breach. The vents opened automatically when radiation levels reached a certain threshold, but they could also be triggered manually in an emergency. If someone accessed the right control panel and initiated an emergency vent sequence, the ship would go into lockdown mode for approximately 90 seconds, while the radiation was expelled into space. All non-essential systems would shut down during that time, including the cell barriers. Jake felt his pulse quicken. That was the opening they needed. But how could they trigger an emergency vent from inside their cells? Lisa had an answer. She could not do it from her cell, but if she could reach any control panel in the execution chamber, she might be able to access the ship's systems. Vraxian security focused on external threats and prisoner containment. Their internal systems were less protected because they assumed no prisoner would ever be free inside the ship. It was a gap in their thinking born from arrogance. They had never encountered a species quite like humans before. The plan began to take shape through tapped messages passed along the wall. They would cooperate during the move to the execution chamber. They would appear defeated and compliant. Once in the chamber, they would wait for the right moment. Lisa would need to get to a control panel. Chris would need to provide a distraction, and Jake would need to be ready to act the instant the barriers failed. It was not a good plan. There were too many variables and too many ways it could fail, but it was better than nothing. Jake spent the remaining hours of the night cycle working on his restraints. When the guards came to move them, they would certainly put some kind of control device on each prisoner, probably a shock collar or neural inhibitor. He needed to understand how such devices worked. His belt buckle tool was too crude for detailed work, but he managed to pry open a small section of the wall panel where he could see the control mechanisms for his cell barrier. The technology was sophisticated, but it followed logical patterns. Power flowed through a primary circuit with a backup system that activated if the primary failed. The controls responded to signals from a central computer. If he could understand the signal patterns, he might be able to interfere with a similar device worn on his body. The lights began to brighten. The day cycle was starting. Jake quickly replaced the maintenance panel and positioned the sleeping platform back over it. His fingers were raw and bleeding from the work, but he felt more prepared than he had hours before. He moved to the center of his cell and sat down. His body ached. His head still throbbed. But his mind was clear and focused. The guards arrived 30 minutes into the day cycle. There were 4 of them, all heavily armed. They wore armor that covered their chests and shoulders. Their weapons looked like rifles, but with a strange crystalline component near the barrel. Energy weapons, probably. The lead guard approached Jake's cell and spoke in that harsh Vraxian language. The translator in the ceiling converted his words. Jake was ordered to move to the back of the cell and place his hands on his head. He obeyed without hesitation. The barrier shimmered and disappeared. 2 guards entered his cell while the others kept their weapons trained on him. One guard carried a device that looked like a metal collar with a small box attached to the front. The guard moved behind Jake and placed the collar around his neck. It closed with a soft click and immediately tightened until it was snug against his skin. The sensation was uncomfortable but not painful. The guard stepped back and touched a control on his wrist. The collar activated with a low hum that Jake could feel through his bones. The guard explained through the translator that the collar could deliver 3 levels of response. The first was a warning shock. The second was a paralyzing pulse that would drop him to the ground in agony. The third was lethal. Instant death. He was ordered to walk forward slowly with his hands visible at all times. Jake did as instructed. He shuffled out of his cell and into the corridor. Chris was already there, wearing an identical collar. His face was bruised and one eye was swollen nearly shut, but he stood straight and met Jake's gaze with a slight nod. Lisa emerged from her cell moments later. She looked worse than both of them. Blood matted her hair on one side and she moved with a limp. But her eyes were sharp and alert. She caught Jake's glance and gave the smallest shake of her head, a signal that she understood the plan and was ready. The guards formed up around them in a standard escort formation. 2 in front, 1 on each side, and 2 behind. They began walking down the corridor. Jake counted his steps and tried to memorize the route. They passed through 3 sealed doors. Each one opened as they approached and closed behind them after they passed. The ship was larger than Jake had imagined. The corridors were wide enough for 3 Vraxians to walk side by side. The ceilings were high. Everything was built to accommodate their size. They passed other crew members going about their duties. Some stopped to watch the prisoners walk by. Others barely glanced at them. Jake noticed that most of the Vraxians wore variations of the same scaled armor. Some had markings on their shoulders that might indicate rank. The ship had a military feel to it. Everything was orderly and efficient. There was no wasted space and no decoration. This was a vessel built for war. After 10 minutes of walking, they reached a larger door that required 2 guards to operate. Beyond it, Jake could hear sounds, voices, movement. The door opened and they were led into the execution chamber. The room was massive. The ceiling rose at least 30 feet above them. Tiered seating lined 3 walls, already filled with Vraxian warriors and officers. At the center of the room was a raised platform with 3 marked positions. The floor around the platform was polished to a mirror shine. Holographic displays floated in the air showing different angles of the room. This execution was going to be broadcast just as the voice in his cell had promised. The guards led them to the platform and forced them to kneel. Jake's knees hit the hard surface with a painful impact. The collar around his neck hummed louder as if warning him not to move. He kept his head down, but his eyes scanned the room. There were at least 50 Vraxians present, maybe more in the upper tiers, all of them watching, all of them waiting to see the humans die. A figure emerged from a doorway behind the platform. This Vraxian was larger than the others, easily 9 feet tall. His scales were darker, almost black with hints of deep red. He wore elaborate armor decorated with what looked like bones, human bones. Jake felt his stomach turn. This was the executioner. In his hands he carried a staff taller than Jake. At the top of the staff was a crystal that glowed with an inner light. Blue and white energy swirled within it like a trapped storm. The executioner walked slowly around the platform. He stopped behind each prisoner in turn as if sizing them up. When he stood behind Jake, the human could feel heat radiating from the crystal. The executioner moved to the front of the platform and raised the staff. The room fell silent. Even the background hum of the ship seemed to fade. A magistrate stepped forward from the crowd. He was older, with pale scales and markings that suggested high rank. He began to speak in Vraxian. The translator provided the words simultaneously. The magistrate listed their crimes: violation of territorial boundaries, acts of military aggression, destruction of Vraxian property. Each accusation was met with a synchronized hiss from the crowd. It was an eerie sound like wind through dead trees. Jake forced himself to remain calm. He looked to his left where Chris knelt. His friend's jaw was clenched, but his breathing was steady. To the right, Lisa was watching the room with careful attention. She was looking for control panels, looking for their opportunity. The magistrate finished his speech and stepped back. The executioner moved to stand in front of Chris. He spoke in Vraxian and the translator relayed the question. Final words. It was part of their ritual, a way to honor the condemned before death. Chris said nothing. He simply stared ahead with cold defiance. The executioner waited a moment, then moved to Lisa. He asked the same question. Lisa spoke quietly. She said she hoped her family would know she died bravely. The executioner nodded as if approving of her answer. Then he stood before Jake. The crystal on his staff pulsed with light. The heat from it made Jake's skin prickle. The executioner looked down at him with eyes that were completely black. Reptilian and alien and utterly without mercy. He asked the ritual question in a voice that boomed through the chamber. Final words. Jake took a breath. This was the moment. Everything depended on what happened next. He raised his head and met the executioner's gaze. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. He said 5 words that made the entire chamber go silent. Final words. You first. The chamber exploded with noise. Vraxians throughout the room began hissing and growling in their native language. Some rose from their seats. Others gestured wildly. The executioner stood frozen above Jake with his staff still raised. His black eyes widened in what might have been shock or rage or perhaps even something like respect. No prisoner had ever spoken to him that way. No condemned being had ever turned the ritual question back on the one who would kill them. It violated every protocol and tradition of the execution ceremony. Jake kept his eyes locked on the executioner. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced his expression to remain calm. This was the distraction they needed. This was the moment of chaos that might give them a chance. The collar around his neck hummed dangerously. One of the guards had his hand on the control ready to deliver a shock. But the executioner raised his free hand in a stopping gesture. The guard hesitated but did not press the button. The magistrate stepped forward shouting something in Vraxian. The translator struggled to keep up with his rapid speech. He was demanding order. He was calling for the execution to proceed immediately. But the executioner ignored him. He continued to stare down at Jake as if seeing the human for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. He asked Jake what he meant by those words. Why would a condemned prisoner ask the executioner for final words? Jake spoke carefully. He said that death came for everyone eventually. Even executioners. Even warriors who thought themselves invincible. If this was truly about honor, then honor should flow both ways. The Vraxians claimed to value courage and strength. Jake was showing both. He was facing death without begging or pleading. He was meeting his end with words that challenged the very nature of the ceremony. That was more honorable than silent acceptance. The chamber grew quieter as Jake spoke. The translator carried his words throughout the room. Some Vraxians were nodding slowly. Others looked confused. Their culture was built on rigid traditions but also on respect for warrior spirit. Jake was gambling that his defiance would be seen as strength rather than disrespect. It was a thin line to walk, and he knew one wrong word could end with the collar around his neck, delivering its lethal shock. The executioner lowered his staff slightly. He turned to address the crowd in Vraxian. Jake could not understand the words, but he could read the body language. The executioner was explaining something, justifying something. When he finished speaking, several Vraxians in the upper tiers began making a sound like slow, rhythmic clicks. Others joined in. It was not the hostile hiss from before. This was something different. Approval, maybe? Or acknowledgement. The magistrate tried to interrupt, but the executioner silenced him with a sharp gesture. The large Vraxian turned back to Jake. He said that the human had spirit. That much was clear. But spirit alone would not save him from judgment. The crimes had been listed. The sentence had been declared. The execution would proceed. However, as a recognition of the human's courage, the executioner would grant him one thing. He would allow the human to stand for his death rather than kneel. It was a small honor, but in Vraxian culture it meant something. Jake nodded his acceptance. This was not what he had hoped for, but it gave him another few seconds. Another moment to prepare. He started to rise, and that was when everything changed. As his weight shifted forward, the collar around his neck loosened just slightly. During the long walk to the execution chamber, Jake had been working the device with tiny movements of his jaw and throat. The mechanism was sophisticated, but it relied on sensors that measured muscle tension and movement. By flexing and relaxing in specific patterns, Jake had managed to create a gap between the collar and his skin. It was barely a quarter inch, but it was enough. He surged upward with all the strength he could gather. His hands shot up and grabbed the staff before the executioner could react. The crystal at its tip blazed with light. Energy crackled across its surface. Jake twisted hard and yanked the weapon toward himself. The executioner was strong, but Jake had momentum and surprise on his side. The staff came free and Jake swung it in a wide arc. The crystal tip struck a control panel mounted on the wall behind the platform. Sparks erupted in a shower of white and blue. The panel exploded with a sound like breaking glass. Alarms began to wail throughout the chamber. The lights flickered and went red. Jake had no idea what system he had just destroyed, but it was enough to cause immediate chaos. Guards rushed toward the platform. The executioner roared and lunged at Jake with clawed hands extended. Chris moved at the same instant. His collar had been damaged during his capture, and the locking mechanism was already weak. He ripped it free with both hands and threw himself at the nearest guard. They collided and went down in a tangle of limbs. Lisa was already moving toward a secondary control panel near the entrance. She had spotted it earlier and memorized its location. 2 guards moved to intercept her, but she was faster. She reached the panel and her hands flew across the holographic interface. Years of engineering training took over. She did not need to understand the Vraxian language to recognize system architecture. Power conduits were power conduits regardless of who built them. She found what she was looking for and initiated an emergency override sequence. The ship's computer responded immediately. A new alarm joined the chorus already filling the chamber. This one was deeper and more urgent. The automated voice announced an emergency plasma vent in multiple languages, including English. All personnel were ordered to secure themselves. All non-critical systems would shut down for 90 seconds. The countdown began. 90, 89, 88. Jake felt the collar around his neck go dead. The humming stopped and the device fell away. He used the staff to block a strike from the executioner. The large Vraxian was incredibly fast for his size. His claws raked across Jake's shoulder, leaving burning lines of pain. But Jake kept moving. He spun and brought the staff around in a sweeping strike that caught the executioner in the ribs. The Vraxian stumbled backward. Chris had wrestled the weapon away from his guard and was now firing at others who tried to approach the platform. The energy bolts were bright purple and left scorch marks wherever they hit. He moved with the precision of someone who had trained for combat his entire adult life. Cover and move, shoot and relocate. Never stay in one place. Several Vraxians fell before his fire. Others took cover behind the tiered seating. The countdown continued. 75, 74, 73. Lisa was shouting coordinates. 3 corridors, turn left. Emergency pod bay. She had accessed the ship's layout and found their escape route. The plasma vents would open in less than 90 seconds, and when they did, the radiation would flood certain sections of the ship. The pod bay was in a shielded area, but they had to get there before the vents opened. Jake delivered another strike to the executioner and then turned to run. His legs felt weak and his vision was starting to blur from blood loss. The shoulder wound was worse than he thought. But he could not stop now. Chris provided covering fire as Jake and Lisa ran for the chamber exit. The doors had sealed automatically when the alarm started, but Lisa's override had unlocked them. They slid open as the 3 humans approached. The corridor beyond was chaos. Crew members were running in all directions. Some were heading for emergency stations. Others were trying to reach shielded areas. No one seemed to know what was happening. The execution broadcast had been interrupted. The ship was in emergency mode, and 3 human prisoners were loose and armed. Guards tried to form up and stop them, but the confusion was too great. Jake led the way with the executioner's staff. He used it like a battering ram, knocking aside anyone who got too close. They reached an intersection and Lisa pointed left. The countdown had reached 45 seconds. They could hear a new sound now, a deep thrumming that came from the very bones of the ship. The plasma drive was building pressure. The vents were preparing to open. They ran faster. Jake's lungs burned. His shoulders screamed with every movement. Behind them he could hear the executioner's voice roaring commands. The large Vraxian was not going to let them escape easily. They turned another corner and nearly ran into a squad of 6 guards. These Vraxians were ready. They had formed a defensive line with weapons raised. Chris fired first and took down 2 before they could react. Jake threw the staff like a spear. It struck the 3rd guard in the chest and sent him flying backward. Lisa grabbed a piece of debris from the floor and hurled it at the nearest control panel. More sparks, more alarms. The remaining guards hesitated for just a moment, and that was all the humans needed. They charged through the gap. The pod bay entrance was ahead. 20 seconds. 15. 10. Lisa reached the door first and slammed her hand against the emergency release. The door opened with a hiss of equalizing. Pressure. Inside were dozens of escape pods lined up in their launch tubes. Most were designed for Vraxian passengers and would be too large. But there in the corner was a smaller pod, probably salvaged from another species, probably intended for emergency use by smaller crew members. It would be cramped for 3 humans, but it would work. 5 seconds, 4, 3. Jake and Chris threw themselves through the pod. Door behind Lisa, she was already at the controls initializing the launch sequence. The countdown reached 0. The plasma vents opened. Jake felt the ship shudder. Through the small viewport, he could see energy bleeding into space. Brilliant white light mixed with purple radiation. The ship's shields were diverting most of it, but some sections would be flooded with lethal doses. Anyone caught outside a shielded area would die within minutes. The pod launched. The acceleration pushed Jake back into the wall. His wounded shoulder hit something hard and he nearly blacked out from the pain. But they were moving. They were away from the ship. Through the viewport, he could see the Vraxian warship growing smaller. Its hull was massive and scarred from countless battles. The plasma vents were still open, streams of energy pouring into the void. And there on the exterior hull near the execution chamber, Jake could see a figure. The executioner. He was standing in one of the observation blisters watching the pod flee. Even from this distance, Jake could see him. And somehow Jake knew the executioner was watching him too. The escape pod tumbled through space like a leaf caught in a storm. Its stabilizers were damaged and the navigation system flickered between functional and dead. Jake pressed himself against the wall trying to stay conscious. Blood from his shoulder wound had soaked through his torn uniform and was floating in small droplets around the cramped interior. The pod had been designed for 2 Vraxian crew members in an emergency, but 3 humans barely fit inside. Chris was wedged near the propulsion controls trying to get them working properly. Lisa had claimed the pilot seat and was fighting with the guidance system. Through the small viewport, Jake could see the Vraxian warship in the distance. Its weapons arrays were powering up. Bright lines of energy began to trace along its hull as targeting systems came online. They had maybe 30 seconds before those weapons locked onto their pod and turned it into debris. Lisa slammed her fist against the control panel and shouted something in frustration. The navigation system was responding, but it kept resetting. The pod's computer had been configured for Vraxian operators, and it was rejecting her commands. Chris called out that he had the stabilizers working at 40% capacity. It was not enough for smooth flight, but it would keep them from spinning out of control. Jake pulled himself toward the viewport using handholds built into the wall. He could see the weapon ports on the Vraxian ship beginning to glow. They were charging. In seconds, those cannons would fire and this escape would end before it truly began. He turned to Lisa and asked if she could get them into faster-than-light travel. She shook her head without looking away from the controls. The pod's jump drive was designed for short hops only. It could not sustain FTL for more than a few minutes, and it needed at least 60 seconds to charge. They did not have 60 seconds. Jake watched the weapons continue to power up. He thought about everything they had survived. The battle that destroyed their ship. The capture. The trial and execution ceremony. They had fought so hard and come so far. It could not end like this. There had to be something they could do, some way to buy more time. He asked Chris if the pod had any defensive capabilities. Chris checked the systems and reported that there were basic countermeasures. Chaff and flares designed to confuse targeting sensors. It might work for a few seconds against less sophisticated weapons, but Vraxian military technology was among the best in the galaxy. Lisa suddenly made a sound of triumph. She had found a workaround in the navigation system. By switching the interface to manual mode, she could bypass the computer's language restrictions. It would mean flying the pod by hand with no automated assistance, but it was better than nothing. She asked Chris to transfer all available power to the engines. They needed acceleration, and they needed it now. Chris worked the controls and redirected power from life support and non-essential systems. The pod's engines flared to life. Jake felt the acceleration push him back against the wall. They were moving faster, but still not fast enough. The first weapon's discharge lit up space around them. Purple energy beams lanced out from the Vraxian ship. Lisa threw the pod into a hard turn that nearly tore Jake's grip from the handholds. The beams missed by less than 50 meters. Proximity alarms screamed inside the cramped cabin. Another volley followed immediately. This time Lisa rolled the pod and dove toward the nearby asteroid field. Jake had not noticed the asteroids before. They were small and scattered, but they offered cover. Lisa was flying them into the rocks. The pod shuddered as it entered the field. Lisa threaded them between spinning chunks of stone and metal. Some asteroids were no bigger than the pod itself. Others were the size of buildings. The Vraxian weapons fire continued, but now the beams were hitting rocks instead of empty space. Explosions blossomed in the void as asteroids were vaporized. Debris pelted the pod's hull with metallic pings and thuds. The forward viewport cracked but held. Lisa's hands moved across the controls with desperate speed. She was flying on instinct more than skill. Every evasive maneuver brought them closer to collision, but also kept them alive for another few seconds. Chris reported that the jump drive was charging. 45 seconds remaining. Another weapons volley narrowly missed them and destroyed an asteroid directly in their path. Lisa flew through the expanding cloud of debris. The pod's sensors were screaming warnings about hull integrity. They had taken dozens of micro-impacts. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the cumulative damage was adding up. Jake watched through the viewport as the Vraxian ship maneuvered to maintain firing position. It was larger and slower than the pod, but it had vastly superior firepower. All it needed was one clean shot. 30 seconds on the jump drive. Lisa brought them around a massive asteroid that was easily half a mile across. It bought them a few seconds of cover. Jake could see stress lines forming on the viewport where it had cracked. The pressure seals were holding, but barely. He asked how much longer they could maintain this. Lisa did not answer. She was too focused on flying. Chris called out that power levels were dropping. The engines were overtaxed and running hot. They might fail before the jump drive finished charging. The Vraxian ship appeared above them. It had anticipated their course and moved to intercept. Its weapons were fully charged and aimed directly at the pod. There was no time to evade. No time to run. Jake saw the weapons begin to fire, and then something unexpected happened. The Vraxian ship's weapons powered down. The glowing energy along its hull faded. The ship held position but did not shoot. Jake stared in confusion. They were a clear target. Easy to hit. Why had the firing stopped? Through the viewport he saw movement on the Vraxian ship's hull. Someone was standing in one of the observation blisters. Even at this distance, Jake recognized the massive silhouette. The executioner. He was watching them. Jake felt a strange moment of connection across the void. The executioner raised one clawed hand in what might have been a salute, or perhaps a gesture of respect. Then he turned away from the window and disappeared into the ship's interior. 15 seconds on the jump drive. The Vraxian ship began to turn away. It was leaving. Chris asked what was happening. Why were they not firing? Jake did not have an answer. He only knew that somehow the executioner had stopped the attack. Perhaps he had convinced the ship's commander that the humans had earned their freedom through combat. Or perhaps Vraxian honor demanded they be allowed to escape after such a display of courage. Whatever the reason, they had been given a chance. 5 seconds, 4, 3. Lisa locked in coordinates for the nearest human outpost. It was 3 days away at normal speed, but the jump would cut that to a few hours. 2 seconds, 1. The jump drive engaged. Space twisted around the pod. Stars stretched into lines, and then they were moving faster than light, moving away from the Vraxian ship and toward safety. The interior of the pod was silent except for the hum of the jump drive. Jake let himself slide to the floor. His shoulder was still bleeding, but slower now. The adrenaline was wearing off and exhaustion was taking its place. Chris moved to help him, tearing strips from his own uniform to make a bandage. Lisa remained at the controls, keeping the pod steady during the jump. She was shaking. Her hands trembled on the flight stick. But she did not let go. Jake asked if they were clear, if the jump was stable. Lisa nodded without speaking. They had escaped. Against all odds, they had survived. Chris finished wrapping Jake's shoulder and then sat back with a long exhale. He said he could not believe what had just happened. They had been seconds from execution. They had fought their way out of a Vraxian warship. They had stolen an escape pod and evaded a military vessel. It should have been impossible. Jake thought about those final moments when the executioner had stopped the weapon's fire. He wondered what had gone through the alien warrior's mind. Had he seen? And something in the humans that reminded him of his own people. Had he recognized that courage existed in species beyond the Vraxians? Or had he simply followed some code of honor that Jake did not fully understand? Whatever the reason, Jake felt a strange gratitude toward the creature who had been moments away from killing him. The jump would last for 6 hours, according to the pod's computer. After that, they would drop back into normal space near the human outpost. There would be medical facilities, ships, contact with Earth Command. They would be debriefed and questioned. Their story would be analyzed and documented, but all of that was still hours away. For now, they were simply 3 humans in a damaged pod, drifting through the strange unreality of faster-than-light travel. Lisa finally spoke. She asked Jake why he had said those words to the executioner. "Final words, you first. Where had that come from?" Jake leaned his head back against the wall. He said he had not really planned it. In that moment facing death, he had simply refused to accept it quietly. Humans did not bow before executioners without making them work for it. Humans did not go gentle into any night. They fought and struggled, and sometimes they said things that changed the entire situation. Chris laughed. It was a tired sound, but genuine. He said that Jake had nearly given him a heart attack with that stunt. But it had worked. It had created the confusion they needed. It had shown the Vraxians that humans were not like other species they had conquered. Humans were unpredictable and dangerous and worthy of respect. That message would spread. The execution had been broadcast. Thousands of Raxians had watched humans turn the ceremony into an escape. That would change things. Jake hoped Chris was right. He hoped their actions would make a difference. But mostly he was just grateful to be alive. He closed his eyes and let the exhaustion take him. His shoulder throbbed with pain and his body ached in a dozen places. But he was breathing. His heart was beating, and somewhere ahead in the vast darkness of space was home. They had survived the execution chamber. They had escaped the warship. Now they just had to make it back to tell their story, to let humanity know that even in the face of certain death there was always a chance. Always a moment where courage could turn the tide. Always an opportunity to look at death itself and say, not today. The escape pod dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a violent shudder that woke Jake from unconscious sleep. His shoulder was stiff and the pain had settled into a deep ache that radiated down his entire arm. Lisa was still at the controls, looking exhausted but alert. Chris had moved to the communication station and was trying to raise someone on the emergency channels. Through the viewport, Jake could see a small space station hanging in the void. It was human-built with the distinctive modular design of frontier outposts. They had made it. Chris got a response on the third attempt. A traffic controller demanded their identification and purpose. Chris explained who they were and what had happened. There was a long pause on the other end. Then the voice came back different now, urgent and commanding. They were ordered to hold position. Defense ships were being scrambled. Medical teams were being prepared. The controller asked if they needed immediate assistance. Chris looked at Jake's shoulder and said yes, they needed medical help, but they were stable for now. 2 fighter craft appeared within minutes. They flanked the escape pod and escorted it toward the station. Jake watched the fighters through the viewport. They were Earth Defense Fleet models, sleek and deadly. Seeing them made something tight in his chest finally relax. They were safe. They were among their own people again. The station grew larger as they approached. Docking clamps extended to receive the pod. Lisa guided them in with careful precision. The clamps locked onto the hull with a series of metallic clangs. They had arrived. The airlock opened and medical personnel rushed in before Jake could even stand. They had stretchers and equipment. A doctor began examining Jake's shoulder immediately while firing questions at him. How long ago was he wounded? Had he lost consciousness? Was he experiencing any numbness? Jake answered as best he could, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about what came next. The debriefing. The questions. The investigation into what happened to their ship. They were taken to the medical bay and separated. Jake was placed in a treatment room where a surgical team went to work on his shoulder. The wound was deep but clean. No major arteries had been hit. They irrigated it and sealed it with synthetic tissue. The doctor said he was lucky. Another inch to the left and the executioner's claws would have severed something vital. Jake almost laughed at that. Luck. He had been captured, sentenced to death, and nearly killed a dozen times. But yes, in the end, perhaps luck had been on his side. The debriefing started 6 hours later. Jake was still in a hospital gown with his arm in a sling when 2 officers entered his room. They introduced themselves as Commander Patricia Stone and Intelligence Officer Vincent Cole. They had questions. Lots of questions. Jake told them everything. The ambush in the Kepler system, the destruction of his ship, the capture and imprisonment, the execution ceremony, the escape. He left nothing out. Stone took notes on a data pad while Cole recorded everything. When Jake described the moment he spoke to the executioner, both officers stopped and exchanged glances. Stone asked him to repeat exactly what he said. Jake told her again. Final words, you first. Cole leaned forward and asked what had prompted that response. Jake thought about it. He said it was instinct. A refusal to accept death passively. A human response to an impossible situation. Stone nodded slowly. She said the execution had been broadcast across Vraxian space as planned, but it had not had the effect the Vraxians intended. Cole explained that intelligence had intercepted dozens of Vraxian communications in the hours after the escape. There was confusion and debate among their military leadership. Some called for immediate retaliation against human colonies. Others argued that the humans had won their freedom through honorable combat. The execution broadcast had been shared on other alien networks as well. Species throughout that sector of the galaxy were talking about the humans who turned an execution into an escape, about the commander who challenged his executioner with 5 words. Stone said that diplomatic channels were exploding with activity. Some alien governments were expressing concern about human unpredictability. Others were showing interest in potential alliances. The Vraxian Empire itself had made no official statement yet, but their ships had pulled back from the disputed border zones. It was as if they were reassessing their view of humanity. Jake asked if that was good or bad. Stone said it was complicated, but it meant humanity was being taken seriously in a way they had not been before. The debriefing lasted for 3 hours. By the end, Jake was exhausted and his shoulder was throbbing despite the pain medication. Stone and Cole thanked him for his cooperation and left. Jake was alone again. He lay back on the medical bed and closed his eyes. He thought about his crew, the ones who had died when the ship was destroyed. They deserved to be remembered. Their sacrifice had not been meaningless. In a strange way, their deaths had led to this moment. To a shift in how humanity was perceived among the stars, Chris and Lisa were released from medical the next day. The three of them were given quarters on the station while arrangements were made for transport back to Earth. Jake spent most of his time staring out the viewport at the stars. He found himself thinking about the executioner often, wondering what the massive Vraxian was doing now, whether he faced consequences for allowing them to escape, whether he thought about the human who had challenged him. News of their escape spread quickly through human space. Within a week, Jake started receiving messages from his family, from old friends, from people he had never met who wanted to express their admiration or ask questions. The media wanted interviews. Politicians wanted to meet with him. It was overwhelming. Jake declined most requests. He was not interested in being a celebrity. He was a soldier who had done what was necessary to survive. But he agreed to one interview. A journalist named Amy Peterson came to the station and sat with him in a quiet observation room. She asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to his answers. When she asked about the moment with the executioner, Jake tried to explain what he had been feeling. He said it was about refusing to be diminished by death, about maintaining dignity and humanity even at the end, about showing that humans would not break no matter how much pressure was applied. Amy asked if he had been afraid. Jake said of course he had been afraid. Fear was natural, but fear did not mean surrender. Fear could exist alongside courage. That was what made courage real, doing what needed to be done despite being terrified. He said he hoped people would understand that. He hoped they would know that being human meant fighting for every breath and never accepting defeat until there was no other choice. The interview was published across Earth networks and republished on colonial worlds throughout human space. Jake's words resonated with people. They became a rallying cry of sorts. Humans who felt small in the vast galaxy found strength in his story. The phrase "you first" began appearing in unexpected places. Painted on ships, written in messages, spoken as a reminder that humanity would face any challenge on their own terms. 3 weeks after the escape, Jake, Chris, and Lisa were transported back to Earth on a military vessel. They arrived to a ceremony at fleet headquarters. Medals were awarded. Speeches were given. Jake stood on a stage in front of thousands of people and felt completely out of place. This was not who he was. He was not a hero. He was just someone who had refused to die quietly. After the ceremony, Jake went to visit the families of the crew members who had died. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, sitting in living rooms and looking at parents and spouses and children, telling them that their loved ones had died bravely, that they were remembered. Some families were angry. Some were grateful for his visit. All of them were grieving. Jake carried that weight with him. It would never leave. Months passed. The incident faded from the news cycles as new events captured public attention. But the effects continued to ripple outward. Diplomatic relations with several alien species improved. The Vraxian Empire eventually made contact through back channels to discuss a ceasefire in the disputed territories. They never officially acknowledged what happened at the execution, but their actions spoke clearly. They had gained respect for human resolve. Jake returned to active duty after his shoulder healed. He was offered a promotion and a position at fleet headquarters, but he declined. He requested assignment to a patrol ship in the outer colonies. Stone tried to convince him to reconsider. She said he could do more good training new officers or working in strategic planning, but Jake knew where he belonged. He was not a desk officer. He was not a symbol. He was a ship commander who belonged among the stars. A year after the escape, Jake received an unexpected communication. It came through encrypted channels and took days to decode. The message was simple. It said that the executioner remembered the human who spoke with courage. That honor had been satisfied on both sides. That perhaps someday they would meet again under different circumstances. There was no signature, but Jake knew who had sent it. He saved the message and sometimes read it when he needed to remember that even enemies could find common ground. The legacy of that day in the execution chamber continued to grow. The story was taught at the academy as an example of tactical thinking under pressure. Psychologists studied how Jake had used psychological warfare against an opponent who expected submission. Military strategists analyzed how 3 prisoners had escaped from a warship. But for Jake, the real lesson was simpler. Humans endured. They adapted. They found ways to survive when survival seemed impossible, and when faced with death, they looked it in the eye and refused to blink first. Years later, Jake would retire from active service with a chest full of medals he never wore and a reputation he never sought. He would settle in a small house on a colony world where the sky was purple and 2 suns set every evening. People would occasionally recognize him and want to hear the story. He would tell it when asked, but always with the same ending. He would say that what happened in that chamber was not about 1 human or 3 humans. It was about what all humans carried inside them, the refusal to surrender, the determination to face any darkness and find a way through, the simple stubborn insistence that they deserved to exist and no one could take that away without a fight. That was the real message. That was what he hoped people would remember long after his name was forgotten, that when someone asks for your final words, you look them in the eye and say, "You first."